My next question is going to be both for Ms. Calder and Mr. Antoni. In your testimony, you both mentioned one way or another the impact of government regulation, whether it be state, federal, or local, on housing prices. What government regulations do you think specifically cause the greatest increase in home prices? We'll start with you, Ms. Calder.
Well, I think there's a broad body of research on, again, state and local zoning regulations. Really, that's coming from the local level. And among those regulations, I think they all sort of add on, augment each other in ways where it's not totally easy to pull any one out and say, if you just fix this one thing, then you would fix housing affordability and housing supply. Because if you fix the one regulation, then the other regulations are all manipulatable, and they can also be made more restrictive in ways that won't allow for housing to be developed. That said, I think density regulations are really problematic. So where you sort of zone the whole city as single-family homes, that's going to be an issue because, of course, it limits housing. And I think aside from that, minimum lot sizes that are very large, those are going to be issues as well. And, just permitting processes that are very lengthy, very uncertain, and very open-ended. That doesn't give developers a lot of confidence as they're going through these processes and trying to make plans.
So it's the amalgamation of all of them, the combined effect of all of them, particularly some of those that you mentioned, like minimum lot sizes and things like that, end up creating an environment in which relatively few people can navigate this Byzantine labyrinth of regulations to be able to get it done. That in turn probably leads to more consolidation, which might help explain at least some of the answer to what Senator Klobuchar was talking about the fact that there aren't as many sort of smaller builders in many communities as there once were, because there's such an advantage that goes to a larger producer who has the experience and the extra resources to be able to devote to complying with those things. Mr. Antoni, do you have anything you want to add to that one?
Senator, I think another key thing that's important not to overlook here are regulations dealing with the financial sector. And the reason that has such an impact in the context of housing is because almost everyone who buys a house does so through financing. And so when we have regulations that force lenders to look at things essentially other than risk, what you are doing is you are divorcing the individual, the borrower, from their ability to repay a loan. And so from the lender's perspective, that builds losses into their business model. And as a consequence of that, they need to spread out those losses among all borrowers. In other words, it increases the cost of capital, it increases the cost of lending, and that trickles down into more expensive mortgages for everyone. One other thing that I think might be getting missed here, because so much of what we're focusing on, and rightly so, is the price of the home, but also what about what is in the home, things like appliances. We have all kinds of regulations, for example, that are aimed at increasing the efficiency of it could be your refrigerator, it could be your dishwasher, your clothes washer, dryer, etc. And so many of these regulations that do increase appliance efficiency are actually a net loss for the consumer because of the increased cost. And when we're talking about these regulation-imposed cost increases, they tend to be completely missed because of hedonic adjustments in things like the CPI, so they're typically not included in inflation metrics. And actually a colleague of mine, Casey Mulligan, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, he has pointed out that the cost of regulations today are, on the average American family, are literally thousands of dollars more per year than they were just 4 years ago.
Yeah, that sort of thing adds up. Plus, a lot of the appliances just don't do as good of a job. But that's a conversation for a different day. But you're exactly right; those add up. And unlike our tax bill, where we can see at the end of the year how much we're paying, you can't see the regulatory compliance costs. There's no comprehensive bill for it. We have in our minds this idea that those are all paid for by corporations, and in a sense they are, but not really, because they get passed down to hardworking Americans who pay higher prices for goods and services, everything they buy. And they also pay for it in meaningful ways through diminished wages, unemployment, and underemployment. What have you observed in your market analyses throughout the country? Are there factors that apply uniquely to metropolitan areas, more heavily populated areas? What do you see there in terms of home affordability, specifically in major metropolitan urban environments?
Well, what we find, Senator, typically is in those major metropolitan areas a higher level of regulation, and we also find higher taxes on average, and so we have higher costs of home ownership in those areas. On page 4 of my testimony, for example, you look at the most expensive areas in the country. Almost all of them are in California in terms of owning a home. In fact, in several of those areas, the median income, it actually requires more than 100% of the median after-tax income to buy the median-priced home in those areas. In other words, it's literally impossible for the typical American family to buy a home in those places. Conversely, as you start getting into typically more suburban or rural areas, and you typically see taxes and regulation go down, home ownership affordability on average does tend to rise.
And that in turn ends up creating even more disparities as you look across the economic spectrum. Because if you're in one of those areas, you're unfortunate enough to live in there, some of the setting aside the graduated income tax system that we have, some of the benefits associated with home ownership, like the mortgage interest deduction, either phases out or ends at, I think, around $500,000 or something like that. So if you happen to be in one of those areas, even if you've got the cheapest home in your community, you might be priced out of it in multiple ways, and making it even harder for people who are just below the economic threshold of people who could otherwise purchase in that area. You may never get there. Thank you, Madam Chair.